Shabbat Shalom. I didn't get finished with my message because I didn't start it till like Wednesday. And then I fell asleep Thursday after I got home from work. And so I tried to finish it up. And for the past like 2 weeks, I've been trying to decide what to speak on. And I had 3 subjects. And I finally chose one Wednesday. I thought, well, that'd be easy. Well, this morning I realized I'm combining all 3. So I'm going to call this Hosea, because I've been reading out of Hosea. I call it Hosea, How Did We Get Here? And I'm going to call it part 1 because I didn't get finished with it. And I wasn't going to get through Hosea anyway. But I'd like to read from the first chapter of Hosea. Hosea was a prophet to the northern tribes of Israel. He was younger than Amos. Amos was before him. Amos was more severe than Hosea. But Hosea had an interesting life, to say the least. And Hosea was the final warning to the northern tribes before they went into captivity. And I want to read the first chapter here. It says, "The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, the son of Berai, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. When the Lord began to speak by Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, Go take yourself a wife of harlotry and children of harlotry, for the land has committed great harlotry by departing from the Lord. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Debelium, and he conceived and bore him a son, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to him, Call his name Jezreel, which means God sows or scatters. For in a little while I will avenge the bloodshed of Jezreel on the house of Jehu, and bring an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And it shall come to pass in that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. And she conceived again and bore a daughter. Then God said to him, Call her name Lo Ruhamah, which means no mercy. For I will no longer have mercy on the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. Yet I will have mercy on the house of Judah, and will save them by the Lord their God, and will not save them by bow, nor by sword or battle, by horses or horsemen. Now when she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, she conceived and bore a son, and God said, Call his name Lo-Ami. It means not my people. For you are not my people, and I will not be your God. Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered, and it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, You are not my people, there it shall be said to them, You are sons of the living God. So Paul quotes this in Romans chapter 9 and verse 25 and 26. And he's in Romans he says, As he says also in Hosea, I will call them my people who were not my people, and her beloved who was not beloved. And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, You are not my people, there they shall be called the sons of the living God. Paul and Jesus both quoted Hosea quite a bit. I can't remember how many times. But and back to Hosea starting from verse 11. Then the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together, and appoint for themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. You note here that it differentiates, it calls them then the children of Judah and the children of Israel. So there were two separate things. It says they shall be gathered together and appoint for themselves one head. And I don't really understand this last part where it says, and they shall come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. Is that's the great of the day of the scattering, or the when God sows? I don't know about that. But and from here, I want to go back and talk about Abraham. In Abraham, we know God called Abraham in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, and he gave him some promises. Now the Lord said to Abram, Abraham's name was Abram back then, is get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. The only thing wrong was Abraham didn't have any sons. And he didn't have any for many years after the promise was made. So Sarah, his wife, she got impatient with God, and she gave him Hagar, her handmaiden, and he got a son called Ishmael. But Ishmael wasn't the son of promise. God soon gave him Isaac by Sarah. Isaac was the son of promise. And Paul uses this analogy, I think it's in Galatians, to expound upon the difference in walking in the Spirit and walking according to our own understanding or the flesh. When we walk in the Spirit, we're walking by faith, holding on to the promises by faith. And if we're walking according to the works of the law, we're actually walking according to the flesh, because the works don't save us. It's our faith in Jesus and God that saves us. Then in Genesis 26, 3 through 5, Isaac has the promise passed to him. In Genesis 26, verse 3, it says, "Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oaths which I swore to Abraham your father, and I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." So Isaac married Rebekah, and they had twin boys, Esau and Jacob. But Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of stew. He didn't pursue God like he should have. He kind of cast away God for his immediate pleasure, the things of the world. And anyway, Jacob got the blessing, got the birthright, and he got the blessing from Isaac. And in Genesis 27, 28, and 29, I think this is where Isaac blesses him. It says, "Therefore may God give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine, Let people serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren, and let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you. So that's like reiterating part of the blessing of Abraham. And Jacob left home. And Jacob left home and wrestled with God one night while he was sleeping under the stars. And God gave him the name of Israel. Jacob had set out to get a wife. He found Rachel and fell madly in love with her, but soon found out marrying her was some hard work, to say the least. And he had to marry her older sister first. He wanted to marry Rachel, and he ended up with 4 wives, 13 kids, 12 boys and a girl named Dinah. And so this brings us to Joseph. Joseph was the 11th son, but he was the firstborn of Rachel. He was Jacob's favorite son, so much so that Jacob gave Joseph a special coat. And we all know the story about how his brothers threw him in the pit and then sold him into slavery, and he was carried off to Egypt. And how he ended up in jail, being falsely accused. That sound familiar? Paul was thrown in jail falsely accused. And Jesus was crucified being falsely accused. And he ended up helping Pharaoh with his dream, and he was elevated to being second only to Pharaoh in all of Egypt. He got a wife and had twin sons. So Joseph, he ended up living most of his life as an Egyptian. He looked like an Egyptian. He had a big, long Egyptian name. He had an Egyptian wife and kids and a big, high-power Egyptian job. And his father thought he was dead, but he wasn't. And we know the story about how the drought came, and most everybody knows that. And how his brothers came to get grain, and he was reunited with his brothers and eventually his father. And in his father's old age, when they all moved there, his father's old age, he did something interesting. In Genesis 48, 3 and 4. It says, Then Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make you a multitude of people, and give this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession. And he is recounting the blessing that he had received. And he is telling Joseph this for a specific reason. He is fixing to bless Joseph's 2 sons. But in verse 5, he does something interesting. And he says, in verse 5, he says, And now your 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. Notice he says, they are mine. And then he says, as Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. This is like an adoption ceremony that is happening here. He says, these 2 are mine, even as Reuben and Simeon. Now, who are Reuben and Simeon? Well, they're Jacob's first and second born. So Jacob is actually here, he's elevating his grandkids as firstborn sons. So what happened with Reuben and Simeon? Reuben got in trouble back in Genesis 35:22, where it says, And it happened when Israel dwelt in the land that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, which is his wife. And Israel heard about it. So that wasn't good for Reuben. And Simeon joined himself to Levi in dishonoring Jacob in the Shechem slaughter. So Jacob says they will be his firstborn, and here's why. In Genesis 48:13, it says, and Joseph took them, I guess it goes all the way to 16. It says, and Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand towards Israel's left hand, and Manasseh with his left hand towards Israel's right hand, and brought them near him. Then Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, guiding his hands knowingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads. Let my name be named upon them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. So out of all his sons, he chose these two to carry on his name, and that was a big deal back then. And so he continues in verse 17. When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him, so he took hold of his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But in verse 19, this is important. In verse 19, his father refused and says, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. That phrase there that says multitude of nations, and this is something I learned here recently. I didn't realize. That phrase says multitude of nations in the King James. In the ISR scriptures, it says completeness of nations. In the Tree of Life version, it says fullness of nations. So the word multitude can mean complete, multitude, and fullness. I forgot to write down what word that was, but you can look it up. And the word nations is Strong's number H1471, Gawi, which is translated nation 374 times, heathen 143 times, Gentiles 30 times, and people 11 times. So it can actually be read, but his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become fullness of the Gentiles. I thought that was interesting because of some other prophecies that talks about the fullness of the Gentiles. So Ephraim will become the fullness of the Gentiles. Some recap here, what we've just went through. God's promises are passed all the way down to Jacob. God changes Jacob's name to Israel in Genesis 35:10. Joseph, who is number 11 of the 12 sons, is sold into slavery by his brothers. That's in Genesis 37:28. God ends up exalting him to the highest rank in Egypt as promised to him in Genesis 41:39 and 40. And all the blessings of the birthright promises given to Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Jacob, Israel, are passed on to Ephraim and Manasseh. Reuben, the firstborn, does not receive the blessings and birthright promises. And we find out why, where it's chronicled in 1 Chronicles 5:1 and 2. Where it says, now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, He was indeed the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, so that the genealogy is not listed according to the birthright. In the second verse it says, Yet Judah prevailed over his brothers, and from him came a ruler, although the birthright was Joseph's. So then we got fast forward through history. Joseph died, and everyone was living in Egypt. A new Pharaoh came along and enslaved the people to the point that they cried out to God. God lifted up Moses, and he came saying, Let my people go. Every time I read that, I think of Charlton Heston. And he led them out of Egypt and bondage and brought them to Mount Sinai in Midian. They did the Red Sea crossing and all that. And they brought them to Mount Sinai in Midian to receive the Torah and become a nation. But they made the golden calf and wandered in the desert for 40 years, which brings us to the Jordan River. And before they cross over, they have to stop and listen to what Moses has to say. And in Deuteronomy 31, I'm not going to read it, but God tells Moses of Israel's future rebellion. And he taught him a song to teach to the children of Israel. I'm not going to read the whole song because it's long. But I'll read the last part of it here from Deuteronomy. I printed the whole thing. I'm not going to read it. From Deuteronomy 32, 44 through 47, I think. So Moses came with Joshua, the son of Nun, and spoke all the words of this song in the hearing of the people. And Moses finished speaking all these words to Israel. And he said to them, Set your hearts on all the words which I testify among you today, which you shall command your children to be careful to observe, all the words of this law. For it is not a futile thing for you, because it is your life, and by this word you shall prolong your days in the land which you cross over the Jordan to possess. Which is kind of like a reminder of all that they were taught in Deuteronomy 28. And I'll read Deuteronomy 28, verses 63 through 67. And it shall be that just as the Lord rejoiced over you to do good and multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you and bring you to nothing, and you shall be plucked from off the land which you go to possess. Then the Lord will scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods, which neither you nor your fathers have known, wood and stone. And among these nations you shall find no rest, nor shall the sole of your foot have a resting place, but there the Lord will give you a trembling heart, failing eyes, and anguish of soul. For your life shall hang in doubt before you, and you shall fear day and night, and have no assurance of life. In the morning you shall say, Oh, that it were evening, and in the evening you shall say, Oh, that it were morning, because of the fear which terrifies your heart, and because of the sight which your eyes see. So that is the warning they had if they refused to follow the instructions given to them, which would have brought the blessings and security. In Deuteronomy 29, Moses is commanded to renew the covenant. I say renew, but if you read the verse, it kind of says that he's supposed to give them a new covenant, but it doesn't negate the old one, so it's sort of a renewed covenant. In Deuteronomy 29, verse 10, it says, All of you stand today before the Lord your God, your leaders and your tribes and your elders and your officers and all the men of Israel, your little ones and your wives, also the stranger who is in your camp, from the one who cuts your wood to the one who draws your water, that you may enter into covenant with the Lord your God and into his oath, which the Lord your God makes with you today, that he may establish you today as a people for himself, and that he may be God to you, just as he has spoken to you, and just as he sworn to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will make this covenant and this oath, not with you alone, but with him who stands here with us today before the Lord our God, as well as with him who is not here with us today. So this covenant was for everybody that was there, whether they were part of the tribes or part of the multitude that was with them. And it's also in verse 15, it says, at the end, it says, as well as with him who is not here with us today. Well, that means everybody that comes later in the future. The covenant is for those also. And they crossed over into the nations, and this is kind of where I didn't finish, but I'm going to try to wrap it up here. I wanted to get to Jeroboam, at least. And it says, the people, they wanted a king. They wanted to be like other nations. And actually, God knew they'd want this because back in the Torah, I can't remember where it's at. I didn't have time to look it up. But he actually, in the law, is the guidelines for how to choose a human king and what they were supposed to do and everything. It's all in the guidelines and the stuff they were supposed to follow. So he knew this would come. Of course, he knows the end from the beginning. But I wanted to get to Jeroboam, but I wanted to get there through some other stuff. But I'm just going to go ahead and go to 1 Kings chapter 12. I'm going to read verse 25 through 33, because this is like where the northern kingdom actually went wrong, and they never recovered from this. In verse 25, it says, of chapter 12, it says, Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the mountains of Ephraim, and dwelt there also. He went out from there and built Peniel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, Now the kingdom may return to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn back to their Lord, Rehoboam the king of Judah, and will kill me and go back to Rehoboam king of Judah. Therefore the king asked advice, made 2 calves of gold, and said to the people, It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt. Where have we heard that before? It's the same thing that Aaron said when he presented the calf at Sinai, and I didn't realize that until I read it a while ago. And he set one up in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Now this thing became a sin for the people. For the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. He made shrines on the high places and made priests from every class of people who were not of the sons of Levi. And Jeroboam ordained a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month. So he made a new feast, like the feast that was in Judah, which wasn't in the 8th month, I don't think, is in the 7th, and offered sacrifices on the altar. So he did at Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he made. And at Bethel he installed the priest of the high places which he had made. So he brought false sacrifices, set up a false priesthood, and he made offerings on the altar which he had made at Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, in the month which he had devised in his own heart. And he ordained a feast for the children of Israel, and offered sacrifices on the altar and burned incense. I think it's important to remember that these people weren't following the Torah at all. They were totally counterfeit in their worship. And there were some that didn't follow this, and when they went back and joined themselves to Judah, just like he feared. But the people wanted to be like the world, like the other nations. But in John chapter 15, verse 19, Yeshua tells us that if you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. In 1 Peter, I'm going to close with this. In 1 Peter 1, chapter 1, verse 13 through 16, it says, "Therefore gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ, as obedient children, not conforming yourselves to the former lust, as in your ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, be holy, for I am holy." And those are good words to live by. And someday I'll get back to Hosea. Because that all ties into Hosea. Shalom.